Hi, my name is Yana Pavlasek. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan's Robotics Institute, and I'm going to be presenting our work, Parts-Based Articulated Object Localization and Clutter using Belief Propagation. We want to enable robots to use hand tools so that they can do a broad variety of assembly and maintenance tasks. And in order to do this, they need to be able to localize the tools and use their various parts towards task completion. We want to emphasize the perception challenges of this task, so the objective of this work is to recognize and localize the pose of articulated hand tools in a cluttered scene towards task completion. To be more specific, given the robot's RGB and depth observation, we want to localize the 6C pose of each object part. And this is a challenging perception problem because scenes can be highly cluttered, which can lead to partial observations of the objects. The localization problem is high dimensional, especially in the presence of articulations, and the fine geometric features of the tools can be difficult to see in the depth image. I'll focus on previous work done on rigid body and articulated pose estimation, which are both topics that have received significant attention from the robotics community. For rigid body pose estimation, generative inference has been a popular technique which has been used for robust estimation in challenging conditions. However, these methods tend to require hard coding of likelihood functions and be computationally expensive. Recent advances in deep learning have led to the success of end-to-end methods for pose estimation. However, these methods require a lot of training data and can be prone to noisy estimates. More recently, some methods have leveraged both of these techniques successfully. However, learning has mostly been used on a limited portion of the problem, such as just for initialization, and these methods have not considered articulated objects. In terms of articulated body pose estimation, various techniques have been applied to the estimation of these objects. One such technique is the interaction-based approach, in which articulations are inferred based on interactions with the objects. Another approach uses deep learning to estimate joint angles from point cloud data for each object category. These methods tend to use only the depth image and are focused on large objects with simple geometries. In vision, parts-based detection of articulated objects has been used to improve detection. More recently, this approach has gained traction as a way to understand the internal structure of objects and how to use them. In work most closely related to IROS, articulated bodies are factored into parts and represented graphically, and belief propagation is used to estimate the marginal belief over parts poses by leveraging known prior relationships between the object parts. Dessing et al. Made significant improvements to the computation times of these methods in recent work, but this approach still relies on computationally expensive, hand-coded likelihood functions and was only validated on depth data. Our belief propagation technique is based off this 2019 work, but we leverage RGB information and a learned likelihood and are able to handle more complex small object geometries. So our method does 6C parts-based pose estimation of articulated hand tools in cluttered scenes. We implement a hybrid generative discriminative approach which uses belief propagation with a learned likelihood. Building on lessons from the factored approaches in the literature, we model the tools using a Markov random field. The object is split into parts, which represent both its articulations and the affordances present in the object. And each node represents the pose of an object part, while the edge represents the geometric relationship between the parts. Given the observations of the parts, the joint probability of the Markov random field can be factored as a product of two clique potentials. The first is the Pairwise Potential, which represents the compatibility between neighboring nodes. And the second is the Unary Potential, which represents the compatibility of poses with their observations. The main technical insight of our work is that by incorporating data-driven techniques and probabilistic inference, we can leverage the strengths of both. The Pairwise Potential allows us to leverage known geometric relationships, while the learned Unary Potential uses a convolutional neural network to allow for fast estimation and removes the need for us to hard code complex likelihoods. And belief propagation maintains belief to be robust to difficult environments such as cluttered scenes. Our belief propagation problem is formulated as follows. For each node, its belief is the product of the unary potential with its observation and the incoming messages from its neighbors. The messages are sum product messages, which are the sum for each particle of the product between the pairwise potential between a node and its neighbors, as well as the unary potential of those neighbors, and any incoming messages to the neighbor. We represent the belief non-parametrically as a set of particles which are weighted according to these equations. Our approach uses a convolutional neural network to process the robot observation and generate pixel-wise scores per parts. These scores, along with the object's articulation model, are used in a probabilistic inference loop, which reweighs and resamples a set of particles representing the belief over part poses. First, I'll discuss the choice of network. We use the dilated ResNets model, which gives us a pixel-wise score for each object part class. On the right here is the argmax version, which represents the class which got the highest score at each pixel. This segmentation mask is used to detect which objects are in the image, and we initialize an instance for each of those objects in our inference process. We also use this segmentation mask to initialize part pose hypotheses. Now I'll describe how we calculate the potentials we use to weigh the pose hypothesis particles. The unary potential represents the compatibility of a pose with the observation, and this represents one of the main contributions of our work. So take, for example, the clamp handle and its corresponding part observation, which is the heat map from the segmentation network. The unary potential for a hypothesis pose is the intersection over union between this heat map and the binary part mask of the part transformed into image space. So when the mask has little overlap with high heat areas in the heat map, it will have a low unary score, but as the hypothesis pose moves closer to the ground truth location, the unary score should be maximized. The pairwise potential represents the geometric compatibility between two pose hypotheses for neighboring parts. Let's look at the example of the bar node sending a message to the clamp handle. When the handle lies outside of the articulation constraints with the bar, it will get a low pairwise score. And when it lies perfectly in the articulation constraints, it gets a score of 1. We also implement an optional augmentation step where we can augment the distribution before reweighing the particles. The distribution can be augmented by drawing from candidate distributions, where the goal is to preserve modes and encourage quicker convergence by taking advantage of the geometric structure of the problem. We consider 3 candidate distributions. First is a random distribution, which samples particles based on the segmentation map. Next is a unary distribution, which draws samples proportional to the unary weights. And the last is a pairwise distribution, which generates compatible poses from neighboring particles. The final candidate particle set is the union of particles drawn from each of these 3 sets. And the number of particles drawn from each set is a hyperparameter to be tuned. Now I'll present the results we've achieved with our approach. We implement our method using a custom dataset which contains 8 tools along with their meshes and kinematic descriptions. Our dataset contains about 6,000 total images of both cluttered and uncluttered scenes, which we then further augment in training. And the ground truth data includes parts-based M full tool, masks, and poses. In our experiments, we pass the image through the network to obtain the part-wise heat maps. And we use these in combination with the object articulation models in our belief propagation pipeline to infer belief over part poses. We draw the maximum likelihood estimate from the marginal belief of each part to get our pose estimates. We compare against 2 baselines. The first is a segmentation baseline where we initialize objects in the segmentation map and refine their orientation with ICP. The second is a parts-based particle filter, which involves an independent particle filter at each object part, which does not take advantage of the geometric structure of the object. We perform an ablation study over different variations of our method. The first uses message passing and a unary potential, which is only informed by the RGB information. With this method, we sometimes observe that the belief appears to have converged well in the image, but the estimate has found a local minimum, with large errors in the axes that aren't well represented in image space. One way we address this is by adding an ICP refinement step to our final estimate. We also include a variation where we include a depth term in the unary potential, which encourages pose hypotheses to match the depth observation. The augmentation step is implemented on this last method. For our evaluation metric, we use the average point matching error, sometimes called ADD. This represents the average error between corresponding points in the point cloud of the object transformed to the ground truth and estimated point clouds. This graph shows the percentage of poses with matching error under a given threshold. All variations of our method outperform the baselines, which do not take advantage of message passing techniques. The best performing method is when we include depth information in the unary potential. While the augmentation step leads to a slight decrease in performance on average, we qualitatively observe that it helps speed convergence, but in our experiments it has the tendency to propagate incorrect guesses because of artificially inflated pairwise scores. The performance of augmentation depends on hyperparameters which might be tuned to better mitigate this. Our results show that our method performs well in the challenging case of heavy clutter. In this example, even though there are heavy occlusions which lead to missing information for some parts in the heat map, our method is able to successfully localize each of the 4 tools in this image. The final estimates show that the tool's full 60 poses were recovered. We've proposed a method to estimate articulated hand tool pose by parts, which works well even in heavy clutter. Our efficient belief propagation technique leverages geometric priors and a learned likelihood to perform 60 localization in RGBD observations. Thank you for your attention. Please check out our paper and our video linked here for more details.